Mai te tupua, mai te tawhito. Hara mai koe whē, hara mai koe tū whakaotini, koe tū whakaotiranga. O koutou manawa ki o mātou manawa he tāna ka iri hia. Whāno, hara mai te tōki haumi e hui e taiki. Ko te kupu tuatahi, ko te wehe ki te atua nāna rā tātou i whakawhaiti mai runga i te ora me te pai. I hui a mai rā i runga i te reo karanga o te whare wānanga o Waikato ki ngō tātou rangatira. Tau mai nei ki runga i te kaupapa o te rā, ana e tohe waka nei i runga i tō tātou Waikato Management School, te raupapa. Te reira, nau mai, piki mai, kake mai. Nau mai e ngā manipiri tuarangi. He rongo ake nei, ko koe tēnā, e herena kraka. Hoki mai ki Waikato Tainui. Hoki mai ki te pāhu. Hoki mai ki te kingitanga. Hoki mai ki te whare wānanga o Waikato. Nei tō tātou rangatira, te Amorangi, a Matt Bolger, te tamaiti o tō tātou rangatira o te wā. The Right Honourable Jim Bolger, a nei tana tama e whakatau ake nei a koutou. Hare mai. Hare mai me ngā tini aitua, me ngā tini mata i wainga nui a koutou. E ai te kōrero i kura i tangihi he mai aroha ki a rātou ko menea ki te pō. No reira e ngā tangi, e ngā mate. Haere atu rā, oki. Kia hoki mai ki a tātou e pai nei raro i ngā mana ki ta ngā te runga rawa. Tēnā koutou. Nau mai, i runga i te reo karanga, o te tumuaki o te whare wānanga o Waikato, a Neo Quigley. Nau mai, ki runga, i te papa whenua o Ngāti Wairere, e whakatau ake nei a koutou. Tēnā koutou, he wai. Kupu whakaotinga ki a rātou ko mene hia nei ki te pō, āpiti hono tātai hono rātou te hunga wairua ki a rātou moe mai. Āpiti hono tātai te kanuhi ora e hui nei raro i te reo karanga o te kaupapa o te rā, tēnā koutou, arā, tēnā tātou, ka huri.
Kia ora tātou, haere mai ki te whare wānanga o Waikato, haere mai ki te raupapa, and welcome to the 2022 New Zealand Economics Forum, brought to you by the University of Waikato and the Waikato Management School, Te Raupapa. As you know from the program ahead of us, we have a great couple of days where we're going to be traversing a lot of topics in a world that's frankly facing a lot of challenges on many fronts. It's a very strong program. Unfortunately, of course, we can't be here face to face, but it does mean that we've got a live stream going out to a much broader audience. Before I hand across to Neil Quigley, the Vice-Chancellor, to formally open this forum, on the screen where you're watching the live stream, please connect with the Slido app or the technology. You can feed through your questions. The moderators over the next 2 days will be able to see those questions come through, and so they'll be able to feed those through to the different panellists we've got over the next 2 days. My name is Matt Bolger. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Waikato Management School, and I'll be the host over the next 2 days. Now, to formally open the 2022 New Zealand Economics Forum, I'd like to hand over to the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Waikato, Professor Neil Quigley.
Rangi e tū, papa e te koutou, te whariariki o pa tātou te wherawheru, pai māriri. Ngā te wairiri, e taki, ngā mihi nui. E rā rangatira mā huri noa e te matu, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Greetings everyone, welcome and thank you all for attending the second University of Waikato Economic Forum. The current economic environment is very complex, and so the discussions in this forum assume a particular importance. More so because we have a great lineup of speakers who are in each case both well-known leaders in their field and able to provide a wide range of perspectives on the current economic environment and the challenges that it presents. To set the scene, I'd like to take just a few minutes to reflect on the complexity of this current environment that we find ourselves in. The COVID pandemic has created both a demand shock and a supply shock to the economy. The demand shock's been managed to a large extent by fiscal policy, with large-scale government spending on wage subsidies and investment designed to stimulate economic activity. Of course, the government response has not been costless, and in particular, public debt has increased substantially. The supply shock has reduced our capacity to produce goods and services in some, but not all, sectors. It's particularly apparent in the labour market following the closure of the border and the inability over a 2-year period to import both short-term and long-term workers, as well as supply chain disruption and, of course, significant increases in the prices of many imported goods. A second area that's particularly noticeable in the economy at present is that there have been significant relative price adjustments over the past 2 years. While some of those price changes are relative, domestic and international supply chain disruptions and the closure of the border mean that we face a real danger of inflationary pressure becoming widespread and feeding through into inflationary expectations, with consequent implications for wage and salary expectations, of course. Up to this point, there's been some upward pressure on non-tradables inflation, that is domestic inflation, particularly in wage and salary increases, but the change has been mostly in tradables inflation. Remember that we're coming off a decade in which tradables inflation was muted or at times negative, and even changes in oil prices were swamped by a wider trend for imported goods and services prices to stay static or in some cases decline, at least in nominal terms. It's not clear over what period or even if the forces that drove that period of subdued tradable inflation will re-emerge, which puts more pressure on our ability to manage non-tradable inflation. GDP in New Zealand and our major trading partners is now higher than before the pandemic. But while some sectors have done and are doing extremely well, in others it certainly does not feel as though we're in the midst of a strong recovery at this point. Indeed, a recovery at all. The country's annual trade services balance has gone from an almost $4 billion surplus at the end of 2019 to an over $4 billion deficit now an $8 billion hole. And this has occurred essentially because New Zealand has written off two enormous foreign exchange earners, tourism and international education. And of course, in those sectors affected by tourism and education, the implications of that change are enormous. So I'd just like to briefly touch on a few of the implications of this environment and some of the things that you'll be hearing about from our subsequent speakers. One topic of conversation will be about our attempts to manage inflation over the next period of time. So one of the things we know is that the neutral interest rate at the moment is lower than it was in the past, due in significant part to a global glut of savings. In addition, there's a lot more debt in the markets that will be affected by interest rate movements, including, of course, in relation to mortgages. So interest rates probably don't need to move as far as they did in the past to have the required effect on dampening inflationary expectations. You'll be hearing more about that later in the forum from the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Adrian Orr. Labour market shortages are, in some minds, anticipating to be relieved reasonably quickly with the announcement of the opening of the border. But one of the things we know, and I see this from the perspective of the education sector, is that having had our border closed for 2 years means that it's not easy for Immigration New Zealand to quickly turn around to be acting in the way that they were before the COVID pandemic hit. I think that means that labour market shortages and our ability to bring in international students and other key aspects of our economy are going to take some time to return to what we were used to in the past. A further significant area of discussion in the forum, which I think is obvious to all of us as a really important issue in our current economy and society, is the way in which the COVID pandemic, all of the price changes and the responses to the pandemic have affected inequality. And I think we are all aware of the implications of that, particularly as the wealth of those who own houses has increased relative to other people in our society. And finally, I'll mention the social, psychological and political implications of the pandemic and the public health response. While in this forum we'll be focused on the economic issues, I hope that a future forum will focus on some of those wider implications of the pandemic and our response to it, because I think it's apparent to all of us that things in New Zealand have changed substantially as a result of the pandemic. The way in which people think, their attitudes, and the way in which we are talking about them have all changed. And I think it's really important, once we have just a little bit of distance between us and the worst of the pandemic, that we have that conversation. Can I close just by thanking the conference organisers for all the work that they've done to pull this together and for their perseverance in having the forum despite the constraints of needing to do it online, and to thank all of the speakers for their perseverance in sticking with us as we moved to online and being willing to continue to participate. We look forward to all of the discussions. It's a great lineup of speakers, and I'm sure it's going to be a very lively discussion. Thanks to all of you once again for joining us at this forum.
Kia ora, Neil, thank you. So I'm joined here by a special guest for the next 2 days, Stephen Joyce, former Minister of Finance, former Minister of many things. It's great to have you here. So as you know, we've got a big program ahead. You'll be moderating several of the sessions yourself. We're touching on everything from health, education, Māori economy, traditional fare of monetary and fiscal policy. What are the big themes that you're looking at over the next couple of days?
Well, I think We're almost operating at about two levels here. We're actually dealing with the economic issues in each sector. So you've got the health sector, which we know has got big challenges, education sector, the Māori economy, business more generally. So we're dealing with those, and a lot of those today. And then we're also dealing with the macroeconomic, which sort of is over the top of everything. And as Neil mentioned, we're dealing with the inflation challenges, which are out in front of us, frankly, I think, at this point. So we have tomorrow, we have a panel with monetary policy. We also have the Reserve Bank Governor tomorrow, fresh out of the monetary policy statement on Wednesday. Yep. So he'll be very interesting. Fiscal policy as well tomorrow. And of course, you're about to have Treasury Secretary Caroline McLeish as well, who will no doubt have her views on where we're at and how we're going. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's really important to have these conversations at a time like this where we have a lot of forced change caused by, firstly, the pandemic, but there's other events in the world, of course, Ukraine and so on. And it's important we make that as wide a dialogue as possible. So I'd encourage everybody to get in and ask their questions. The moderators are all ready to have those questions and air those questions with the presenters. And we're going to have as much of a two-way conversation over the next 2 days as is possible with the technology, which is pretty good.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. So a timely reminder, please do look at that Slido app, get the questions coming through. They'll appear on a screen for us here in the studio. Big morning. We're about to be joined by Dr. Caroline McLeish, followed by a session on health. And then former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Helen Clark, will join us, and then on through the afternoon. So a fantastic day ahead